George Harrison, the quietest Beatle, rarely spoke much about his personal feelings. Yet when it came to one individual, his emotions were unmistakable, festering over time into a bitterness that approached pure loathing. This raises an intriguing question: who inspired such intense animosity in George Harrison? Delving into his life story reveals a man shaped by adversity, a fighter forged in hardship. His journey commenced in one of the most difficult periods and locations conceivable. Born on February 25, 1943, in a modest two-bedroom dwelling at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool, his birth occurred during the city's 78th consecutive night of bombing raids in World War II. For the Harrison family, existence meant enduring air raid warnings, darkness, and constant dread. Survival itself was uncertain, and his parents, Harold and Louise, possessed little more than unwavering resolve to sustain them. Economic deprivation was a perpetual reality in the Harrison home. Harold labored through exhausting, demanding shifts as a bus conductor, bringing home a paltry sum of roughly £3 each week. To economize, he frequently walked long distances rather than pay for his own bus fare. Louise took on whatever employment she could secure, often cleaning offices at night for just a few shillings per building. Their entire weekly food allowance amounted to only 15 shillings, making meat a luxury and extras almost unattainable. The Harrison children often went to sleep hungry, and George shared a single bed with his brothers until he turned 16. Despite these overwhelming struggles, the household was not without affection. Louise, especially, filled their small home with optimism. She wholeheartedly believed in her children's aspirations and made considerable sacrifices to nurture them. Years afterward, when George needed money for musical equipment, she pawned her wedding ring to help buy him an amplifier, demonstrating the family's steadfast commitment to his passion. That passion first took hold when George was 12. In 1955, while cycling, he passed a house where Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel drifted through an open window. He halted, utterly captivated. The combination of Elvis's voice and the guitar's resonance ignited something permanent within him. Returning home, he informed his mother that he desired a guitar more than food, and she took his words seriously, recognizing the intensity of his dedication. At 14, George acquired his initial instrument, a cheap Eggman flat-top from Frank Hess's music shop, costing 30 shillings, a substantial sum for the family. Though the guitar was challenging to play and his fingers bled from practicing chords, he refused to quit. He practiced 6 to 8 hours daily, persisting until the discomfort became irrelevant. His schooling suffered as teachers noted his sole interest appeared to be guitars, not geometry, history, or other subjects. Music had fully consumed his thoughts. Soon, Paul McCartney entered his life. They encountered each other on the number 86 bus to Liverpool when Paul spotted George carrying his guitar. George mentioned he could perform 20 Flight Rock, a complex piece at that time. Impressed, Paul organized an audition for George with his group, the Quarry Men. Before John Lennon, George played raunchy flawlessly, though he was just shy of 15. Lennon considered him too young, but Paul strongly advocated for him, and George's evident talent ultimately won John over. He became the youngest member of the ensemble that would eventually revolutionize popular music. Having battled his way from poverty into music through sheer persistence, George now confronted new difficulties, but the struggles inside the band would prove even more formidable. As the Beatles achieved greater fame, this imbalance intensified further. George had his own compositions, but the dominant Lennon-McCartney writing partnership steered the band's artistic path. From the outset, John and Paul had an implicit understanding that they would serve as primary songwriters. George could add material, but only sparingly. Throughout most of the Beatles' existence, he was restricted to 1 or 2 tracks per album, regardless of how many concepts he proposed. This limitation did not arise from a shortage of material. By the mid-1960s, he had accumulated numerous songs, many matching or surpassing those by John and Paul. The fundamental issue was that his creative input was not equally appreciated. His initial songwriting endeavor occurred in 1963 while bedridden with illness during a tour stop in Bournemouth. Out of monotony, he composed Don't Bother Me, which appeared on the album with the Beatles. Though not a masterpiece, it demonstrated his capacity to produce songs fitting the band's style. Still, his development as a writer was hindered by ongoing rejections and the perception that his work lacked significance. Each time he sought to advance, he was reminded that Lennon and McCartney held control. Outside the recording studio, the media compounded his irritation by assigning each Beatle a simplistic label. John was the clever one, Paul the attractive one, Ringo the fortunate one, and George was designated the quiet one. This nickname was more than a mere tag, it functioned as a restriction. Journalists and fans viewed him as reserved and introverted, overlooking his wit, viewpoints, and increasing talent as a composer. To the outside world, George Harrison appeared as a secondary figure, not the creative force he was becoming. Being treated as the younger sibling within the group and marginalized by the press left George harboring years of frustration, a resentment that would eventually erupt. In 1960, at just 17, George and the Beatles traveled to Hamburg, Germany. They were not yet famous, and the experience was hardly glamorous. It was harsh, noisy, and extremely taxing. They played in small venues where owners demanded constant energy and non-stop entertainment. Each evening, the band performed up to 8 hours consecutively with minimal breaks, stretching songs, improvising, and maintaining audience interest despite exhaustion. For teenage George, this was an intense lesson in stamina. Living conditions worsened the challenge. They slept in cramped, unsanitary quarters, often behind the clubs, surrounded by noise and grime. Privacy was absent, and comfort unattainable. The Reeperbahn district, where they worked, was filled with criminal activity, drinking, and aggression. Club security personnel were intimidating figures, some with violent histories, and altercations could erupt unexpectedly. George and his bandmates had to rapidly adapt to survive in this environment, learning not just about music but about resilience. The rejection of George's songwriting proved even more wounding. By then, he possessed many strong compositions, but John and Paul seldom gave them proper consideration. Pieces like All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Not Guilty were dismissed or set aside. When George later released them as a solo artist, they became classics, confirming that his bandmates had undervalued him. Their creative approaches diverged notably. Lennon and McCartney produced quickly, almost mechanically, while George wrote more contemplatively. Instead of recognizing this as an asset, the band viewed it as a deficiency. Matters culminated on January 10, 1969, during the Get Back sessions. Following another argument, George quietly placed his guitar aside and declared he was quitting. He did not shout or protest, he simply departed. John Lennon's response revealed how cold relations had become, shrugging and suggesting Eric Clapton could replace George, implying George's role was no longer indispensable. George eventually returned but imposed strict terms. Rehearsals moved from Twickenham to Apple Studios. He refused participation in Paul's proposed live television concert, and he demanded greater opportunities to present his songs. That he needed to negotiate for respect illustrated the situation's deterioration. George's tolerance was diminishing, and his suppressed anger would soon become undeniable. For years, George Harrison had been marginalized while John Lennon and Paul McCartney dominated Beatles albums. However, in 1966, circumstances changed. On Revolver, George finally secured space to demonstrate his songwriting abilities. The album commenced with Taxman, a sharp political commentary on Britain's tax rates. Opening with George's track was itself a declaration, indicating this was no longer exclusively Lennon and McCartney's group. Remarkably, he contributed 3 songs to the record: Taxman, Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You, a rarity for him that reflected increasing confidence and determination. But this advancement proved temporary. The subsequent year, the band initiated work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which would become a landmark recording. For George, the experience was frustrating and alienating. He proposed only a northern song, criticizing unfair publishing and financial arrangements within the group. John and Paul rejected it, disregarding his objections and denying him proper placement. Instead, George contributed just one track, the evocative Within You Without You. Inspired by his growing fascination with Indian music and spirituality, he recorded it with Indian musicians and producer George Martin, creating the piece entirely without Lennon, McCartney, or Starr. It became the first Beatles song completed without the other members. Although critics later acclaimed it as among George's finest work, his bandmates showed little interest in attending sessions. To them, it was merely another George composition, but to him, it demonstrated his isolation. Finally, in 1969, George achieved vindication on Abbey Road. For the first time in the Beatles' history, one of his songs received equal. George Harrison is remembered as the spiritual Beatle, seeking meaning beyond celebrity. Yet contradictions permeated his life. Despite devotion to meditation and Indian philosophy, he often succumbed to temptations he condemned. This conflict between ideals and actions characterized his post-Beatles years. His spiritual path began with an unplanned LSD experience in the mid-1960s, when a dentist secretly added the drug to his and John's coffee. The profound effect changed his perspective, suggesting life involved more than material success. LSD directed him toward Indian music, sitar study with Ravi Shankar, and ultimately Hindu teachings and the Hare Krishna movement. But while his spiritual quest was authentic, he battled drug dependence, using cocaine heavily in the 1970s, smoking excessively, and drinking more than admitted, harming his health. Yet he continued, warning others about ego and excess while indulging himself, even advising Elton John to avoid cocaine though he remained addicted. Friends viewed this as hypocrisy, also recognizing his internal conflict. His relationship with wealth presented another contradiction. He sang about materialism's emptiness, with living in the material world addressing how money and fame distract from spiritual growth. Yet George occupied Friar Park, a 120-room Victorian mansion with gardens and lakes, collected luxury cars, and enjoyed rock star privileges. Outsiders saw preaching contradicted by living. The reality was complex. George genuinely believed material things failed to provide happiness but appreciated beauty, comfort, and financial freedom. He could meditate one moment and drive a sports car the next, not viewing himself as saintly but as torn between worlds. When the Beatles disbanded in 1970, observers wondered about George's prospects. Long treated as junior partner, limited to 1 or 2 album tracks, he exploded with creativity once free of Lennon and McCartney's influence. The result was All Things Must Pass, a triple album surprising the music industry. Many songs originated during his Beatles years but were rejected. Now unrestricted, George demonstrated his material's quality. Tracks like My Sweet Lord, Isn't It a Pity, and the title track conveyed spiritual depth and emotion. The album achieved massive commercial and critical success, surpassing Lennon and McCartney's solo releases. For George, this confirmed he was more than the quiet background figure, underestimated and finally recognized. Soon after, George organized the concert for Bangladesh in 1971 with Ravi Shankar, Bob Dylan, and Eric Clapton, rock's first major benefit event. Aimed at aiding refugees from the Bangladesh Liberation War, it powerfully demonstrated compassion, though financial complications and legal issues delayed aid distribution. Still, it established a model for future events like Live Aid, proving musicians could affect change. Despite achievements, George's anger toward Paul persisted, evident in his slide guitar contribution to John Lennon's How Do You Sleep, attacking Paul post-breakup. He also aligned with John and Ringo in legal disputes against Paul. Their Liverpool teenage bond seemed irreparably broken. In interviews, George openly criticized Paul as controlling and self-centered. Even during occasional 1980s and 1990s collaborations, old grievances remained. Publicly polite, privately he harbored resentment from years of being overshadowed. This combination of liberation and anger defined his post-Beatles existence, proving himself as a solo artist while carrying bitterness from the band's collapse, which provided both opportunity and lasting wounds. By the late 1980s, George experienced recognition alongside resentment. The Beatles' 1988 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction should have been celebratory but revealed ongoing division. Paul refused attendance due to legal disputes. Ringo appeared intoxicated, leaving George to deliver the speech. Though diplomatic, tension was evident. Instead of unity, it highlighted continued discord. George's antagonism toward Paul persisted, with pointed remarks about his personality and music until his final days. With John, the situation was more painful. When Lennon was murdered in 1980, reconciliation remained incomplete. They had collaborated less during the Beatles' final years, and George felt Lennon never respected him adequately. The loss was compounded by unresolved issues and unfulfilled reconciliation. Old wounds persisted, but George's ultimate battles involved his health. In the 1990s, cancer was diagnosed, and treatment followed, though years of smoking had damaged him. As he fought illness, another tragedy occurred. A December 1999 intruder stabbed him multiple times at Friar Park. His wife Olivia fought the attacker, likely saving his life, but the assault caused physical and emotional trauma. For someone seeking peace, violence invaded his sanctuary. As health declined in the early 2000s, George intensified spiritual practices, surrounded by family, friends, and Hare Krishna members, meditating and chanting during his final days. His last words, "Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait," fittingly reflected a life torn between worldly excess and spiritual yearning. George Harrison died November 29, 2001, at 58. His existence combined brilliance and contradiction, deep wounds and spiritual aspiration, leaving music that continues inspiring and reminding us that even the most gifted individuals carry struggles to life's end.